Hey guys, it's Miss Escamilla. Today for your homework, I'm going to go over the strategies and skills for questions 5, 6, 7, and 8. So if you took a look at number 5, you're given a model and you're expected to tell what the decimal is that represents that model. Keep in mind that when we're talking about decimal models, that an entire flat represents, well, let me get a whiteboard. An entire flat represents the ones place and place value. So this represents your ones place. And then anything beyond that represents your tenths and hundredths place. Tenths and hundredths. Okay. So if you have an entire flat, so if you have a picture model and the entire flat of 100 is shaded, that means that you have one hole or a 1 in the ones place. If you were to have 2 flats that were completely shaded in your model, then that would represent 2 holes. If you were to have 3 flats in your model that were completely shaded, that would represent 3 ones or 3 holes. So let's say that we have a model, and in your model, you have, in your picture model, you see that you have an entire flat of 100 shaded. Then that would mean that you had one or an entire hole. And then let's say you were given a picture of another flat, but in this flat, the whole thing wasn't shaded. Let's say that only 3 of the hundredths were shaded. Then that would mean that you would have each one of these little tiny squares within the flat represents 100th. So that would mean that you would have 1 and a 3 in the hundredths place. I don't see that I even I have no tenths shaded, so I would put a 0 in the tenths place. Now let's say I had a model and I had an entire flat. Let's say the whole flat was shaded, the whole thing. That would represent 1 in the ones place. Let's say I was given another flat though, and in my next flat, $20. I'm going to put 2. So in my next flat, I notice that I have an entire tenth shaded here, another tenth shaded here. I'm calling them tenths because when I count all the hundredths within it, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's a tenth. And then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 shaded here. That's another tenth. So those are my tenths. And so I notice that I have 2 tenths shaded. And then I have 2 extra little bitty small cubes shaded, which represents my hundredths. So that would mean I have a 2 in the hundredths place. So this would be a model that represents 1 and 22 hundredths. Okay, so think about that as you're completing number 5. Okay, on number 6, you're being asked to compare decimals and put them in order from least to greatest. And so on number 6, you're supposed to be ordering the decimals that you see in the picture from least to greatest. So one of the things that I always say to do when you're ordering decimals, so let's say I gave you 17 hundredths. Let's say that I gave you 7 tenths. Let's say I gave you 1 tenth. And then I gave you, let's say, 71 hundredths. And I wanted you to put these in order from least to greatest. The first thing that I told you guys in class was to, if you have any decimals where there's nothing in the hundredths place, put something in the hundredths place. Otherwise, the numbers they don't look really uniform because I noticed that this first decimal goes to the hundredths place, this one goes to the tenths place, this one goes to the tenths, this one goes to the hundredths. I want all of them to go to the hundredths place. It makes it easier for me to order them. So on 7 tenths, I'm going to go ahead and put a 0 in the hundredths place. And on the 1 tenth, I'm going to go ahead and put a 0 in the hundredths place. So now they all look more similar. And then I like to say, pretend like it's money. Pretend like it's money. Man, when I pretend like this is money, it helps me to get a clearer idea of which one is the largest amount of money and which one is the smallest amount of money. So when I look at these decimals, I can see that 10 cents is the smallest amount of money. That's smaller than 17 cents or 70 cents or 71 cents. So I'm going to put least. And then when I look at this again, I know that 71 cents would be greater than 70 cents and 17 cents and 10 cents. So this is going to be my greatest. So already I can start ordering these from least to greatest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and, if I know that this is my least, and I know that 0 and 10 hundredths is my smallest decimal, and then I know I'm going to have 2 more decimals, and then I know my greatest is 71 hundredths, so I'm going to go ahead and put that down in the greatest position. Okay, so that means all I have left to order is 17 hundredths and 70 hundredths. Well, I know that if I have 10 hundredths is the smallest, 17 would be next. 17 hundredths is a little bit bigger, but it's less than 70 hundredths. So my 70 hundredths would go next. And then I kind of just check. I have 10 cents, 17 cents, 70 cents, and 71 cents. That's definitely in order from least to greatest. Okay, so that's your strategy for ordering decimals. Put your zeros in the hundredths place, pretend like it's money, and then put them in order. Okay, on number 7, you are writing the fraction or the mixed number that represents the decimal. Okay, so in this problem, the decimal, you have your decimal there. And so that's just being able to relate fractions and decimals. So for example, if I gave you a decimal that looked like this, well, the 7 is in the tenths place. So I would say that this is 7/10. If I gave you a decimal that looks like this, well, I would read this as 23 hundredths. As a fraction, it would look like this, 23 hundredths. Okay, so these are the fractions that relate to these decimals, but we also have mixed numbers that relate to decimals. So if I were to give you the decimal 4 and 7/10, well, that means I have 4 ones, 4 wholes, and I also have 7 in the tenths place, 7/10. So as a mixed number, it would look like this. I have 4 wholes and 7/10. Okay, if I gave you a decimal such as 3 and 36 hundredths, well, that's 3 wholes or 3 ones. And the decimal point means I also have 36 hundredths. And so I would write it like this. Okay, so use that information as you're working on number 7. On number 8, this standard is adding and subtracting of whole numbers and decimals. So when you're reading number 8, you're either going to be adding or subtracting these decimals. I can't tell you. That is your job to discover and find out whether you should add those decimals or subtract them. The strategy for adding and subtracting decimals is to make sure that you line up your decimals. So for example, let's say I gave you the decimal 3/10, or let's say I gave you 4 and 3/10, and I gave you 2 and 25 hundredths, and I wanted you to add these together, and I would expect you to line up your decimals. So in other words, you would write 4 and 3/10, and you would need to make sure that you line up your decimal point. So when I write 2 and 25 hundredths, let's say I would add, then I would put my 2 right under the 4 because the 2 is in the ones place and the 4 is in the ones place. So they should be lined up together. Then my decimal point, and then I have 25 hundredths. Okay. I notice I have no hundredths in my first decimal. If you have no hundredths, put a 0 there. And then you can add. 0 and 5 make 5, 3 and 2 make 5, 4 and 2 make 6, and my total would be 6 and 55 hundredths. The trick to adding and subtracting decimals is to make sure you line up your decimals. Okay, so make sure that you're lining up those decimals. Okay, all right, good luck.